Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War, by Mitchell A. Orenstein. Narrated by Bob Johnson. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and ebook formats of the book. In the 1990s and in the 2000s, influence flowed from west to east. In the 2010s, influence flowed from east to west. Timothy Snyder, The Road to Unfreedom. 1. Introduction. Don't write a book about Moldova. No one will read it. My wife gives me a lot of sage advice, which I too often ignore. So, the first thing I want to say is, this is not a book about Moldova. This is not a book about small, poor European countries nestled in between Russia and the European Union that seem, in the popular imagination of the West, to have been released from the Soviet Union only to aggravate us on geography exams, lengthen Olympic parades, and provide color to Eurovision song contests. This is a book about something much more troubling and significant. Why politics in the West is becoming a lot more like politics in Moldova or Ukraine, vulnerable countries situated on the front lines of an emerging conflict between Russia and the West. As more countries find themselves on the front lines of this geopolitical conflict fought with conventional and unconventional tools such as cyber warfare, hacking, money laundering, and the threat of nuclear war, they are experiencing political pathologies similar to those that the frontline states have been dealing with for years. As a result, these small, vulnerable countries have a lot to teach us about how bad politics can become and what to do about it. I am writing this book for a Western audience because many of us in the West are suffering from an intense sense of dislocation in politics. If you feel that politics has suddenly gone crazy, this book is for you. In the United States and many European countries, it seems as if politics is suddenly unfamiliar. Old rules have become meaningless, and many of us feel unmoored. It is hard to understand why. I have spent a lot of time being confused myself. Yet, as a professor of Russian and East European studies, I realized that I had a special insight to share. Politics in Europe and the United States increasingly follows patterns well established in Moldova and other small, poor, and vulnerable countries about which most in the West know next to nothing. I have been teaching about these problems for years, and I thought that if I could explain to a general audience how the politics of hybrid war affects the lands in between, we in the West could better understand our own problems and perhaps address them more effectively. That is why I am writing this book. It is about the sudden and surprising relevance of East European politics to Western societies. That is why I am going to start with a short vignette about Moldova before moving on. Please indulge me. This story will sound crazy at first, but I promise that, on further reflection, it will begin to sound all too familiar and, possibly, like a mad parable about our own collective future. In June 2017, the acknowledged kingpin of Moldovan politics, Vlad Plahotniuc, was invited to Brussels, the seat of the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, after a similar trip to Washington, D.C. in May. Moldova is a small, predominantly agricultural country nestled between Ukraine and Romania. Plahotniuc is Moldova's leading oligarch. His business empire consists of many official holdings, including Moldova's two leading TV stations, Prime and TV2+, but also allegedly illegal businesses and scams. Some of Plahotniuc's businesses appeared in the Panama Papers, and he has been accused in the Moldovan press of laundering money from various schemes and investing the receipts in legitimate companies. Some suspect him of stealing a good share of the European Union funds that come to Moldova to promote development. Others allege that he got his start in human trafficking, selling Moldova's young women into bondage in the brothels of Western Europe and Turkey. The very model of a corrupt oligarch in Eastern Europe, Plahotniuc spent 2017 trying to rehabilitate himself in the West, and, by all reports, he succeeded. In December 2017, he published an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal stating that Moldova needed the West's help against an aggressive Russia. One Romanian member of the European Parliament was quoted as saying in May 2016, "I think he is perceived as rather part of the solution than a part of the problem in Brussels. At some point, he said that the problem of Moldova is that the evil is black, but that the angels are not white. There is some truth behind that." In 2016, Plahotniuc's Democratic Party, which he chairs and funds, became the largest political party in the 101-seat Moldovan parliament, not only by winning 19 seats in 2014 elections, but by flipping 22 other members elected as representatives of other parties, presumably through various inducements. Following a damaging scandal in which $1 billion disappeared from the Moldovan banking system, the ruling Alliance for European Integration, of which the Democratic Party was a part, reshuffled the government, and Plahotniuc's Democratic Party became the lead party. Plahotniuc put himself up for the position of Prime Minister, but was rejected by Moldova's then-president for lacking integrity and because he was generally disliked by the majority of the people. After that, Plahotniuc ruled Moldova by proxy through Prime Minister Pavel Filip, but it was Plahotniuc who led Moldova's delegation to Brussels and Washington in 2017. Plahotniuc was welcomed in these Western capitals because he positioned himself as the most powerful pro-European politician in Moldova. Without him, the Alliance for European Integration would be replaced by the pro-Putin socialists under President Igor Dodon. Dodon became known as the Tsar's doormat after he distinguished himself as the only world leader to attend Russia's World War II Victory Day military parade on May 9, 2017. He earned a rebuke for his sycophancy even from President Putin, who likened him to an infamous court jester. Yet Dodon was rising in popularity as citizens in Moldova became fed up with their corrupt, pro-European government. While approximately 1/4 of Moldovans supported an alternative, and presumably less corrupt, pro-Europe alliance led by Maia Sandu, a plurality of voters in early 2018 wanted a pro-Russian party to govern. Meanwhile, Plahotniuc's Democratic Party was struggling to achieve the 5% support required to enter Parliament, at least in public opinion polls. In this context, it was surprisingly easy for Plahotniuc to win Brussels and Washington to his side. "Après moi le déluge," as French King Louis XV said, "After me, the deluge." Brussels and Washington both realized that they were fighting tooth and nail with Russia for influence in the lands in between. In Moldova, it was widely felt that parliamentary elections in 2018 or 2019 would be a turning point from which the country might never turn back. Companies put business plans on hold, and pro-European citizens considered fleeing to Romania, Moldova's EU neighbor, in case of a Russian takeover. Politicians were tense as they geared up for an election that many suspected might be the country's last. The political scene sharply polarized between those willing to cast their lot with Russia and those determined for Moldova to join Europe. Parties advocating a third way, a pro-Moldovan option of balancing both sides, saw their public support dwindle. In this context, Plahotniuc positioned himself as the essential figure on the pro-Europe side, someone you may not like or respect, but who was necessary to fend off a Russian takeover. Hence, he rehabilitated himself in the West. Given that, it may be surprising to learn that Plahotniuc was not only the essential leader of the Alliance for European Integration, but also a covert ally of the pro-Russian President Dodon and his Socialist Party, which enthusiastically advocates a pro-Russian and pro-Putin line. The Socialist Party and Plahotniuk's Democratic Party teamed up in 2017 to revise the electoral system in Moldova to make it easier for the Democratic Party to gain representation in parliament. While they frequently attack one another in public, this public mudslinging is regarded by savvy analysts of Moldovan politics as a show that benefits both sides. A constant battle along geopolitical lines is to Plahotniuk's advantage, as it allows skeptical voters to support him in his attempts to halt the pro-Russian groups. The more ostentatious Dodon is towards the Kremlin, the stronger the reaction of the Moldovan government. So, having a powerful pro-Russian party create anxiety helps Plahotniuk to solidify his position as the pro-European savior. Analysts cite a number of instances, besides electoral reform, of cooperation between the seemingly opposed parties. Plahotniuk's ability to bridge the two sides of the geopolitical divide in Moldova extends to his business operations. Plahotniuk, while decrying Russian influence, has made a fortune rebroadcasting Russian channels on its TV stations, along with their political propaganda. He is the leading rebroadcaster of Russian propaganda, owning the rebroadcasting rights to the leading Russian TV channel, Первый канал. Yet, in 2018, his party advocated banning these rebroadcasts in an effort to reduce Russian influence in the upcoming elections. He held this up to Brussels and Washington as evidence of his tough stance on Russia. Plahotniuk's businesses and political enterprises profit handsomely from both Russia and the EU. Politics in the lands in between present a compelling paradox. On the one hand, the geopolitical conflict between Russia and the West has sharpened polarization. It has forced countries to confront what many view as a civilizational choice, to cast one's fate either with Western or with Russian civilization. This has had the effect of intensifying conflict between people on either side and forcing political parties to identify clearly as pro-European or pro-Russian. Both Russia and the West exacerbate this divide by rewarding parties and individuals that support their objectives. Yet, at the same time, in this intensely polarized political environment characterized by civilizational conflict, the top power brokers benefit by working both sides. The lands in between frequently elevate top leaders like Plahotniuk, who are adept at profiting from both the EU and the United States, as well as Russia. From a purely rational perspective, it is easy to see why. When two enormous outside powers are offering rich rewards for loyalty, the strongest person will be the one who manages to take from both. In a polarized political environment, paradoxically, the greatest asset is not ideology, but flexibility. But what lessons does this hold for the West itself, aside from being a little more careful to whom we provide foreign aid? The lesson is this. As Western countries become a battleground in a broader geopolitical conflict between Russia and the West, the same rules of politics begin to apply. Politics becomes more polarized. People start to regard those cooperating with the other side as traitors to the country or to Western civilization. Extremist politics grows as parties gain funding and media support from outside sources. And yet, paradoxically, the greatest benefits accrue to those who position themselves to win payoffs from both sides in this geopolitical competition. The most effective power brokers are not just shills for Russia. They depend on their strategic positions within Western power structures. They manage to draw resources as brokers of influence between two camps. They have a clear interest in accommodation and in the conflict that requires it. I will illustrate these lessons with examples, and I promise that when you understand this paradox of politics in the lands in between, the seemingly upside-down politics of the West today will snap into focus. The plan for this book is simple. To begin, I lay out the nature of the geopolitical conflict that is threatening Western politics. The questions of whether and to what extent this conflict exists and whose fault it is have become so politically controversial that it is important to set the record straight. In the first chapter, I examine the nature of Russia's hybrid war on the West, why it started, its methods and objectives. In the second chapter, I explore the West's responses, with emphasis on military responses through NATO and national militaries, as well as economic responses from the United States and the European Union, Russia's largest trading partner and geopolitical rival. In the third chapter, I turn to describing the nature of politics in the lands in between: Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to demonstrate how the politics of polarization and power brokers works in the lands in between. In the fourth chapter, I show that these trends not only affect these vulnerable countries between Russia and the West, but also new member states of the European Union and NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. The fifth chapter brings the argument home to the West to explore how the politics of polarization and power brokers also affects core Europe and the United States. Finally, I conclude with some reflections on what is to be done. This book is not intended to be exhaustive, but rather to provide a general introduction to and a distinct perspective from a scholar of Russian and East European studies on a political trend that is shaping the modern world and that everyone needs to know. 2. Russia's hybrid war on the West. On July 16, 2009, a group of 22 Central and East European CEE leaders, mainly former presidents, prime ministers, and liberal intellectuals, penned an open letter to the Obama administration from Central and Eastern Europe. Václav Havel and Lech Wałęsa, two symbols of the 1989 revolutions that ended communism, were among the signatories. The letter responded to the new U.S. administration's attempt to reset relations with Russia. The CEE leaders warned that Russia is back as a revisionist power pursuing a 19th century agenda with 21st century tactics and methods. At a global level, Russia has become, on most issues, a status quo power. But at a regional level and vis-à-vis our nations, it increasingly acts as a revisionist one. It challenges our claims to our own historical experiences. It asserts a privileged position in determining our security choices. It uses overt and covert means of economic warfare, ranging from energy blockades and politically motivated investments to bribery and media manipulation in order to advance its interests and to challenge the transatlantic orientation of Central and Eastern Europe. The signatories called for strengthening NATO and greater U.S. commitment to European affairs. This appeal appeared to fall on deaf ears. The Obama administration continued to prioritize improving relations with Russia over CEE security. Even after the Russo-Georgian War of August 2008, the Obama administration and many West European governments believed that Russia was turning in a liberal direction under President Dmitry Medvedev. The U.S. administration believed it could achieve arms control agreements and win Russia's support for its wars in the Middle East by easing tensions with Russia in Europe. On September 17, 2009, the Obama administration announced that it was dropping plans for a missile defense system in Poland and Czechia in what Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney later called a gift to Russia. The timing was unfortunate, as it corresponded with the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. This episode seemed to show that the Obama administration paid little mind to the open letter's warnings and regarded CEE leaders as alarmist. In fact, the West ignored the appeals of CEE leaders at its own peril. Most Western policymakers tended to view East Europeans as a bit paranoid on the topic of Russia. Traumatized by Russia in the past, these countries appeared unusually sensitive to the Russian threat, even obsessed. Yet today their perspective seems prescient. their close awareness of the Russian threat was a result of their being colonized by Russia or the Soviet Union, or both. But that experience made them into canaries in the coal mine for the West, a valuable early warning system that, unfortunately, was not heeded. It was clear to many CEE leaders by 2009 that Russia had launched an all-out hybrid war on their region, hoping to detach it from the West. This war was pursued in a limited and often covert fashion in order to escape notice. Its methods were largely deniable, such as hacking, media manipulation, and covert funding for political parties. Yet the goals of this hybrid war were broad and ambitious. It targeted not only the NATO military alliance, aiming to divide Central Europe from Western Europe and the United States from its European allies, but also the European Union, a trading bloc and political union seen as a guarantor of peace in Europe by stoking the flames of anti-Europe xenophobic sentiment. Ultimately, Russia sought to divide Western liberal institutions, promote xenophobic extremism, and destabilize Western democracies. This was not a marginal activity for Russia or a byproduct of a range of self-interested actions, but a strategy for hybrid war that addressed what Russia saw as an existential threat from the West. For the West, the realization that Russia was serious about its hybrid war came much later, after a 5-year delay. This failure to recognize what was going on put the West on the back foot in dealing with the Russia challenge. In particular, 3 events changed the minds of Western policymakers and caused them to realize that the West was under a determined attack from Russia. Those were the re-election of Vladimir Putin to the Russian presidency in 2012, the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the U.S. presidential election of 2016, with its allegations of Russian meddling. Between 2007 and 2012, however, Russia pursued an all-out, mainly covert political war on the West without much notice or reaction. Even after these dramatic events, some in the West do not believe, or would prefer not to believe, that we are subject to a determined attack from Moscow. The issue has become massively politicized. Therefore, any examination of the effects of Russia's hybrid war on the West needs to start by describing its very nature. What does Russia want? Why did Russia turn against the West in 2007? Why did it begin to wage a hybrid war against Western institutions, including not only NATO, but the European Union? What are its methods, and does it really make a difference? Why Russia turned against the West. One of the most controversial issues in analyzing Russia's hybrid war with the West is the question of who started it. Lots of words have been spilled on this question, and the best scholars and analysts have produced many potential explanations. However, it is hard to know which one is true. One possible explanation lies with Russian President Vladimir Putin. As opposed to Russia's pro-Western leaders of the late 1980s and 1990s, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, who sought closer relations with the West after years of Cold War enmity, Putin was a horse of a different color. Putin publicly mourned the loss of Russia's Soviet empire. He personally defended the Soviet Union in its last days from the KGB office in East Germany, preventing German citizens from ransacking the KGB building as the Berlin Wall fell. Later, Putin appears to have become enthralled with visions of Russia greatness proposed by Russian fascist thinkers and Eurasianists such as Ivan Ilyin and Alexander Dugin. In this analysis, Putin always, or eventually, opposed the pro-Western orientation of his predecessors and sought to rebuild Soviet Union 2.0 in one form or another. This project was always bound to generate conflict with the West. As David Satter put it, after the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, the West was suddenly faced not only with a masquerade, but with the Russia that had existed all along, that somehow had been overlooked by many Western policymakers and observers. Russia was a kleptocratic mafia state that was fundamentally disappointed with the collapse of its empire and determined to reconstruct it. From my own experience, there is a certain plausibility to the idea that Putin was the author of these changes. At the very beginning of the Putin era in 2000, I was living in Moscow and working at Moscow State University, reputed to be the leading university in Russia. Already, in the first year of the Putin presidency, the faculty and students of the university, under a new Putin-appointed rector, were in the process of throwing out their pro-Western orientations and adopting nationalist official rhetoric. In a broader sense, we know that Russia's shift from pro-Western partner to geopolitical opponent occurred during the Putin presidency, so it makes sense to blame Putin, who directed this reorientation from the top. Another possible explanation, however, is that the West pushed Russia into a corner with NATO expansion and, by creating a sense of insecurity in Moscow, forced Russia to respond to a perceived Western threat. In this view, the West should have known of and respected Russia's threat perceptions, rather than aggravating them by expanding the anti-Russian NATO alliance into Eastern Europe and even admitting former republics of the Soviet Union after the end of the Cold War. By choosing to override Russia's perceived zone of influence, the West generated a predictable reaction from Russia. In this perspective, the conflict between Russia and the West is rooted in what international relations scholars call a security dilemma. In a classical security dilemma, the security of one country is challenged by the reasonable security precautions of another. So, for instance, when the West acts to prevent a security vacuum in Eastern Europe by admitting vulnerable former Russian satellites into NATO, Russia feels challenged, and when Russia launches military exercises or modernizes its armed forces to confront this challenge, the West feels insecure. When NATO places forward troop deployments to deter a Russian invasion, Russia responds by nuclear saber-rattling, and so on. There is no doubt in my mind that Russia and the West are locked in a security dilemma, and the strong implication of a security dilemma is that both sides are to blame for one another's sense of external threat. Another possible explanation that has gained currency is that Russia is a bad state, too large, too insecure, too ambitious for its means, and with too much of a history of imperial expansion to ever fit in with the West. A break was inevitable from the beginning, and it should be no surprise that Russia has adopted a policy of assertiveness against the West, as it has for many centuries. There are many versions of this type of argument that ground Russia's foreign policy behavior in its deep history, rather than in the actions of contemporary leaders like Putin. Some argue that Russia's foreign policy is honor-based, and that slights to its perceived sense of honor can cause radical changes in how Russia treats the West. Others argue that Russia has always been an imperial state and is today either neo-imperial, post-imperial, or trans-imperial, in one way or another, still trying to digest the loss of the Soviet Empire. In these explanations, Putin is the unsurprising result of Russia's loss of empire after 1991 and the unique linkage between politics and geopolitics in the Russian imagination. There is most likely some truth to all of these explanations by my academic colleagues. No doubt some combination of Russia's history as a state, its mindset and culture, its interactions with the West, and the elevation of Putin to the presidency in 1999 are responsible for the current predicament. At the same time, it remains very hard to say which of these potential explanations is the silver bullet that explains everything. All we know for sure is that in 1999, Russia was on the way to closer relations with a West that it emulated in economics and politics, but by 2007, Russia had decided to abandon the pro-Western direction of its foreign policy and launch an all-out political war on the West. This about-face was surprising to many in the West because, until that time, Russia had followed a policy of progressive integration into Western security and economic structures. Foresightful analysts discussed the possibility of Russia joining NATO. Russia, under President Yeltsin, had been invited to join the G7, making it the G8, a club of leading democracies and economies, an organization representing the top table of the Western international system. Russia's decision to sharply oppose the West and its
Sample complete. Ready to continue?